For thousands of years, a secret remained buried beneath the frozen wilderness of Alaska, a secret hidden inside ancient caves that would eventually challenge everything we thought we knew about the first people of the Americas. The story begins in one of the most remote and mysterious corners of North America, on Alaska's western Seward Peninsula, where the land stretches toward Russia, across the narrow waters of the Bering Strait. A series of ancient limestone caves overlooks a dry tributary of the Amuruk Basin. At first glance, these caves appear to be nothing more than silent rock formations carved by nature over thousands of years. But hidden within these ancient walls was a story that would challenge everything scientists thought they knew about the first people of the Americas. These caves, known today as Trail Creek Caves, would eventually become one of the most significant archaeological sites ever discovered for understanding how humans first entered and spread across the American continents. But before we uncover the secrets hidden inside these ancient caves, make sure to subscribe to the channel and help us reach our goal of 5,000 subscribers. The importance of Trail Creek Caves was not recognized immediately. For decades, the site remained just another archaeological location buried beneath Alaska's harsh landscape. It would take more than half a century, groundbreaking scientific advancements, and the revolutionary ability to read ancient DNA before researchers finally understood what these caves truly represented. The bones and artifacts preserved inside Trail Creek Caves were not just remnants of a forgotten past. They were pieces of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that would challenge the traditional story of how the first humans arrived in the Americas and reveal a migration history far more complex than anyone had imagined. The first major investigation began in the late 1940s, when Danish archaeologist Helge Larsen led the first systematic excavations at Trail Creek Caves on Alaska's Seward Peninsula. Working deep inside the remote limestone chambers, Larsen uncovered fragments of human bone alongside carefully crafted stone tools, ivory implements, and the remains of mammoths, bison, and caribou, animals that once roamed the frozen tundra during the late Pleistocene, more than 13,000 years ago. Although the discoveries were remarkable, scientists of that era lacked the technology needed to unlock their greatest secret. The skeletal remains were preserved and transported to a museum collection in Denmark, where they remained largely untouched for more than 60 years. It was not until 2010, when the bones were returned to Alaska under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, that researchers finally had the opportunity to examine them using modern scientific methods. The remains were radiocarbon dated, carefully studied, and, most importantly, subjected to advanced ancient DNA analysis. As genetic technology rapidly improved throughout the 2000s, scientists were finally able to recover DNA that had survived inside the bones for thousands of years. What that DNA revealed was completely unexpected. For most of the 20th century, archaeology had been guided by a remarkably simple explanation for how the Americas were first settled. According to the widely accepted Clovis First theory, a single population of big game hunters crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Asia into Alaska around 13,000 years ago. As glaciers retreated, these hunters were believed to have traveled south through an ice-free corridor before rapidly spreading across North and South America, eventually becoming the ancestors of every indigenous population from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego. It was an elegant theory because it offered a straightforward answer to a complex question. It became the foundation of textbooks, university courses, and archaeological research for decades. But the ancient DNA recovered from Trail Creek Caves, together with genetic evidence from sites across Alaska, Yukon, the Pacific Northwest, Mexico, and Brazil, began revealing a far more complicated reality. Instead of one migration, researchers found evidence for multiple migration waves, genetically distinct populations, mysterious lineages that later disappeared, and timelines suggesting humans may have entered the Americas thousands of years earlier than the traditional Clovis model allowed. The remains from Trail Creek Caves were not an isolated discovery. They were part of a growing pattern showing that the settlement of the Americas was far more complex than anyone had imagined. To understand why these discoveries matter, it is necessary to look back at the theory they challenged. The Clovis first hypothesis was not simply another archaeological idea. It had become scientific orthodoxy. Everything began in 1932 near the town of Clovis, New Mexico, when archaeologists uncovered beautifully crafted fluted stone spear points lying among the bones of extinct mammoths. Their distinctive leaf-shaped design, complete with deep fluted channels carved into both sides, was unlike anything previously found in the Old World. When radiocarbon dating became available during the 1950s, those artifacts were dated to approximately 13,000 years ago, making them the oldest widely accepted evidence of humans in the Americas. For nearly 50 years, the Clovis people were regarded as the continent's first inhabitants. Archaeologists believed they had crossed from Siberia into Alaska over the exposed Bering Land Bridge before moving south through the ice-free corridor that opened between the massive Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets. The theory seemed complete, requiring only one migration, one founding population, and one technological tradition that spread rapidly across two continents. Because the Clovis first model dominated archaeology for so long, any evidence suggesting an earlier human presence was met with intense resistance. Sites claiming to predate Clovis were criticized, their dating methods questioned, and the researchers behind them often faced professional skepticism. Yet, despite those challenges, the evidence continued to grow. At Monteverde in southern Chile, archaeologists uncovered unmistakable signs of human occupation dating to approximately 14,500 years ago, more than 1,000 years before Clovis. The site preserved wooden structures, stone tools, and plant remains within a waterlogged peat bog, allowing extraordinary preservation. Other discoveries soon followed. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania produced evidence suggesting human occupation as early as 16,000 years ago, while the Buttermilk Creek complex at the Friedkin site in Texas revealed stone tools buried beneath Clovis layers, with dates approaching 15,500 years ago. Every one of these discoveries was carefully scrutinized, challenged, and tested. Yet every one survived scientific examination, making it increasingly difficult to defend the idea that Clovis represented the beginning of human history in the Americas. The decisive breakthrough, however, came not from archaeology alone, but from genetics. During the early 21st century, scientists perfected techniques for recovering ancient DNA, first in Europe, where cold climates preserved genetic material remarkably well, and later across the Americas, despite warmer temperatures and more challenging burial conditions. By the mid-2000s, researchers were successfully sequencing genomes from ancient skeletons discovered throughout the Western Hemisphere. Each new genome added another piece to the puzzle. In 2014, scientists sequenced the genome of the Anzac child, an infant buried in Montana alongside Clovis artifacts, revealing that Clovis people were indeed ancestral to modern Native Americans, but also showing they already belonged to a population that had diversified much earlier. In 2015, the genome of Kennewick Man, a 9,000-year-old skeleton discovered in Washington state, demonstrated a clear genetic relationship with modern Native American communities of the Pacific Northwest. 3 years later, in 2018, DNA recovered from the Spirit Cave mummy in Nevada, dating back approximately 10,600 years, confirmed the same pattern and ultimately led to the respectful repatriation of the remains to the Falun Paiute Shoshone tribe. These discoveries confirmed that the people living in the Americas at the end of the Pleistocene were indeed the ancestors of today's indigenous peoples. Yet they also revealed something that no one had expected. The earliest Americans were not a single uniform population spreading across two continents together. Instead, they consisted of multiple genetically distinct groups that had separated from one another thousands of years before the Clovis culture even appeared. Different populations followed different migration routes, settled different regions, and left behind different genetic signatures. With every new genome that scientists decoded, the traditional single migration model became increasingly difficult to defend. By the time researchers turned their attention to another remarkable discovery in central Alaska, it had become clear that the story of how the Americas were first populated was about to change forever. The next breakthrough came from the frozen interior of Alaska, where another discovery would completely transform the understanding of America's first inhabitants. In 2013, archaeologist Ben Potter from the University of Alaska Fairbanks was excavating a site known as Upward Sun River, located in the Tanana River Valley of interior Alaska. The site was already remarkable because it represented one of the oldest known human occupations in Alaska, dating back approximately 11,500 years ago, after the Clovis period, but still within the earliest chapters of human settlement in the region. During excavations, Potter's team uncovered something extraordinary beneath a layer of burned material inside a residential pit feature. Hidden within the ancient ground were the remains of two infants, carefully buried thousands of years earlier. The preservation was exceptional, and unlike many archaeological discoveries, the burial context had remained completely undisturbed. These fragile remains carried a genetic record from a time when humans were still adapting to one of the harshest environments on Earth. Scientists knew that ancient DNA could hold answers that traditional archaeology could not provide. The infant remains were sent for genetic analysis by a research team led by Eske Willerslev of the University of Copenhagen. When the results were published in the journal Nature in 2018, they created one of the biggest turning points in the study of the peopling of the Americas. One of the infants, known as USR1, produced a nearly complete genome. But when scientists compared that genetic sequence with previously known Native American populations, they discovered something unexpected. The genome did not belong to any known group. Instead, it represented an entirely separate lineage, one that had split from the ancestors of all other Native Americans approximately 20,000 years ago and remained genetically isolated in the ancient region of Beringia for thousands of years. Researchers gave this newly identified population a name, the ancient Beringians. The discovery changed everything. The ancient Beringians were not simply an early version of modern Native Americans. They represented a separate branch of human history, a population that had separated from the broader Native American ancestral group, while both populations were still living in Beringia, before large-scale migration into the rest of the Americas began. The implication was profound. The settlement of the Americas was not the result of a single migration wave. Instead, the evidence pointed toward at least two major ancestral groups: the ancient Beringians, who remained in Alaska, and the ancestral Native American population, which continued southward and eventually spread throughout the Western Hemisphere. But the complexity did not end there. The remains from Trail Creek caves became part of this larger investigation. When researchers compared the genetic information from the Seward Peninsula remains with discoveries from Upward Sun River and other ancient DNA studies, they found further evidence of the complicated population structure that existed in ancient Beringia. The people who lived in those Alaskan caves were not part of one simple migration story. They represented a diverse world of human populations that had been invisible to archaeology until ancient DNA technology made their history readable. The Trail Creek discoveries also helped strengthen another important idea known as the Beringian standstill hypothesis. First proposed by researchers including John Hoffaker of the University of Colorado, the hypothesis suggested that the ancestors of Native Americans did not immediately rush from Siberia into the Americas. Instead, they remained in Beringia for thousands of years before beginning their journey south. During the last glacial maximum, when massive ice sheets covered much of Canada and blocked movement into the southern regions, Beringia was not simply a frozen bridge connecting two continents. It was a vast, habitable refuge, a place where human populations could survive, adapt, and evolve while isolated from the rest of the world. According to genetic evidence, this isolation may have lasted for nearly 8,000 years. Beginning around 25,000 years ago, the ancestors of Native Americans separated from their Asian source population. They then remained within Beringia until roughly 17,000 to 15,000 years ago, when retreating glaciers finally opened new pathways southward. During this long period of isolation, human populations changed. The ancient Beringians separated from the lineage that would eventually give rise to northern and southern Native American populations. Other groups may have also emerged during this time, populations that have not yet been identified, populations whose descendants disappeared, and communities whose existence may only survive through fragments of genetic evidence. The remains from Trail Creek caves were therefore more than ancient bones. They were snapshots of a lost world, a window into the hidden diversity of Beringia before humans expanded across two continents. And then the genetic evidence became even more mysterious. In 2015, researchers Pontus Skoglund and David Reich published a study revealing a surprising genetic signal in some indigenous populations of South America, particularly among certain groups in the Amazon basin. Their analysis identified a small but statistically significant genetic component that appeared to be connected to populations related to Australasian peoples, including indigenous populations of Australia, New Guinea, and the Andaman Islands. This mysterious ancestry component became known as Population Y. The discovery raised a major question. How could a genetic connection to distant Australasian populations appear among certain South American groups when there was no clear archaeological evidence showing such a migration route? The distances were enormous. The timing was uncertain. The pathway remained unknown. Yet the genetic signal itself was difficult to ignore. The most likely explanation was the existence of a previously unknown ghost population, an ancient group that contributed ancestry to some early Americans but later disappeared as a distinct population. Their people may have arrived through a separate migration, merged with other Native American groups, or eventually vanished through population changes over thousands of years. Whatever happened to them, their legacy survived only as a faint genetic trace, hidden within a small number of South American populations while remaining absent from most indigenous groups across the Americas. The picture that emerged was no longer a story of one migration or even two migrations. It was a much larger human journey, a complex process involving multiple populations, multiple routes, and thousands of years of movement, isolation, adaptation, and change. Then came another discovery that pushed the timeline back even further. In 2021, a research team led by Matthew Bennett announced evidence from White Sands, New Mexico, that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about when humans first arrived in the Americas. Instead of tools, weapons, or animal remains, researchers discovered something far more direct: actual human footprints preserved in ancient lake sediments. These were not artifacts whose origins could be debated. They were not bones that could have been transported by natural processes. They were the unmistakable impressions of human feet, the footprints of people walking across a muddy lakeshore thousands of years ago. The estimated age of those footprints was extraordinary, approximately 21,000 to 23,000 years old. The discovery immediately sparked debate because the original dating relied on radiocarbon measurements from aquatic plant seeds, which can sometimes absorb older carbon from their environment and produce inaccurate ages. Critics questioned whether the footprints were truly as ancient as they appeared. However, in 2023, a follow-up study led by Jeffrey Pigatti and colleagues used additional independent dating methods to confirm the results. The conclusion was remarkable. Humans were present in North America during the height of the last glacial maximum, thousands of years earlier than the traditional Clovis timeline. They were there before the opening of the famous ice-free corridor, and at a time when enormous glaciers still covered much of the continent. The discovery forced scientists to confront an even deeper mystery. If humans were already in North America more than 20,000 years ago, who were they? How did they arrive? And what happened to their descendants? The discovery at White Sands, New Mexico, changed the timeline of human history in the Americas forever. The footprints were real. The dates were real. And the evidence showed something that many researchers once considered impossible. Humans were already present in North America during the height of the last glacial maximum, thousands of years before the famous Clovis culture, thousands of years before the ice-free corridor between the great glaciers opened, and even thousands of years before the period when many scientists believed the Beringian standstill had ended. The implications were enormous. If the White Sands footprints truly dated back 21,000 to 23,000 years ago, then humans had somehow reached the interior of North America, while massive ice sheets still covered much of present-day Canada. The traditional migration route through the ice-free corridor could not have been the pathway these people used because that route simply did not exist yet. Scientists began searching for another explanation. One possibility was the Kelp Highway hypothesis, the idea that early humans may have traveled along the Pacific coastline, following rich marine ecosystems that provided food and shelter. A coastal migration route may have been possible during this period, but the timing pushed the theory to its limits. It suggested humans were moving along the Pacific Rim far earlier than many genetic models had predicted, creating another mystery that researchers were still trying to solve. Who were the people who left their footprints at White Sands? Were they related to the ancient Beringians discovered through the Upward Sun River genome? Were they members of an even earlier population that entered the Americas and later disappeared without leaving identifiable descendants? Could they somehow be connected to the mysterious Australasian genetic signal found in some South American populations? The number of questions grew faster than the answers. Anthropologist Jennifer Raff of the University of Kansas, author of Origin, A Genetic History of the Americas, has studied the rapidly changing picture of ancient American ancestry. Her conclusion is clear. The simple explanations that once dominated archaeology are gone. The old textbook diagrams showing a single arrow moving from Siberia across the Bering Land Bridge into North America no longer represent the evidence. Instead, researchers are now working within a completely new scientific landscape, a frontier where every newly discovered genome provides answers while simultaneously creating new mysteries. The story of how humans entered and spread across the Americas is not being rewritten through speculation. It is being rewritten through DNA recovered from ancient bones, archaeological sites, and forgotten remains preserved for generations. The Trail Creek Caves discoveries are part of this transformation. They are not the only important discovery from this era, and they may not be the most dramatic. But they represent something equally important. A glimpse into what ancient Beringia looked like near the end of the Pleistocene. The genetic evidence reveals a landscape filled with different human lineages. Some populations would eventually become the ancestors of modern indigenous peoples across North and South America. Some would remain in Alaska for thousands of years. Others would disappear completely, leaving behind only traces hidden within ancient DNA. The peopling of the Americas was not a single moment in history. It was a long and complicated process that unfolded over thousands of years, involving multiple groups, multiple movements, and migrations that scientists are only now beginning to understand. And the evidence may be hiding in places no one expected. Across museums and research collections around the world are thousands of ancient human remains excavated decades ago, long before scientists had the ability to read DNA from ancient bones. Many of these collections may contain genetic information that could answer some of the biggest remaining questions about the first people of the Americas. The story of Trail Creek Caves is a perfect example. For more than 60 years, those remains sat inside a Danish museum collection. They were excavated at a time when researchers could study bones, tools, and artifacts, but they had no way to access the genetic information locked inside those remains. Only after the bones returned to Alaska in 2010, under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, did modern genetic technology allow scientists to investigate their hidden history. How many other ancient skeletons around the world are still waiting to reveal their secrets? How many forgotten collections contain genomes that could completely change our understanding of human migration? The answer remains unknown. But the ancient DNA revolution is accelerating. New laboratory techniques are allowing researchers to recover genetic material from increasingly damaged and fragile remains. Advanced analytical methods are extracting information from tiny fragments of DNA that earlier scientists would have considered impossible to study. At the same time, partnerships between geneticists, archaeologists, and indigenous communities are creating new ethical approaches for researching ancestral remains. The coming years may reveal more information than the previous century of archaeology combined. And every new discovery continues to make the story more complex. The old Clovis first model is no longer supported as the complete explanation. The idea of a single migration event has been replaced by a much more complicated picture. The belief that the ice-free corridor was the only pathway into the Americas has also been challenged. What remains is complexity, a recognition that the peopling of the Americas was just as complicated as the settlement history of any other continent. Multiple populations contributed to the story. Multiple routes may have been used, and the process unfolded across tens of thousands of years. The Trail Creek Caves on the Seward Peninsula are one window into this hidden world. They are not the only window, but they serve as a reminder that the deepest answers about American prehistory are not always found in textbooks. They are hidden in the bones. And after thousands of years of silence, those bones are finally beginning to speak. The region surrounding Trail Creek Caves is part of one of the most archaeologically significant landscapes in North America, the ancient world of Beringia. The original Bering Land Bridge, which once connected Asia and North America, disappeared thousands of years ago as global temperatures increased and sea levels rose after the end of the Pleistocene. Today, much of that ancient landscape lies beneath the cold waters of the Bering Strait.